Our next speaker is Emily Wilcox. I just want to emphasize that this is not just conference for art historians. We have dance historian, we have a film historian, and Emily works in the field of dance. She's associate professor of modern Chinese studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's a specialist in Asian dance and performance with a focus on socialist and post-socialist dance histories in China and transnational circulation. She's the author of Revolutionary Bodies, Chinese Dance and a Socialist Legacy, and a co-editor of Corporeal Politics, Dancing East Asian, forthcoming next year. She has published in various academic journals. She also co-curated exhibition 2 years ago called Chinese Dance, National Movements in a Revolutionary Age, 1945 to 1965, and co-created Pioneers of Chinese Dance, a publicly accessible photograph archive and digital humanities project. So she's currently writing a book on border-crossing dancers and the cultural politics of a leftist Asian internationalism during the Cold War. And I'd just like to mention, Emily is also a practicing dancer, right? Let's welcome Emily.
Thank you, Mia, for that wonderful introduction. I was especially excited when Mia invited me to the symposium because somehow she knew the questions that have been circulating in my mind and driving my work. I'm not sure how she found that out, but it was kind of an amazing connection, and I think we'll see there's actually really direct links from Ming's paper as well. So I want to start by giving the 3 questions that I'm really thinking about in today's talk. And hopefully you'll see as I go through how I come back to these questions as I'm going. So the first one is, what is the relationship between the national and the transnational in 20th century Asian dance histories? How did the construction of national dance forms rely on movements of dancers across and beyond national borders? The second question, how did the politicization of inter-Asian identifications, as in the case, for example, of Japanese Pan-Asianism, Soviet Eastern internationalism, or the Bandung movement, lead to new forms of artistic expression? How do the cross-ethnic and cross-national dances that emerged out of these political movements, dances in which dancers performed Asian identities other than their own, push us to think in new ways about the politics of cultural appropriation and ethnic impersonation in the performing arts? And the last question, in what ways can a focus on diverse inter-Asian networks of artistic connectivity and circulation challenge persistent binaries in the study of 20th century art in Asia, namely that of East and West, and that of communist and free? So to answer these questions, I will first talk about the transnational history of one particular national dance form in Asia, that of Chinese dance as it developed in the People's Republic of China during the decades immediately following the end of World War II. And then I will expand upon this story to propose 4 inter-Asian dance networks that facilitated different politicized notions of Asia and the East, expressed in dance in the mid-20th century. Throughout, I will be paying close attention to how the lives of individual dancers force us to think in new ways about the geographic trajectories of cultural circulation, particularly of leftist inter-Asian dance culture throughout this period. So the first part, I'm going to talk about some of the transnational border crossing experiences that led to the creation of Chinese dance in China during the socialist period. And this was a topic of the book that I just published at the end of 2018, which Mia already introduced, which if anyone is interested, I was fortunate enough to publish open access. So the book is freely downloadable and open internationally. And what I was really interested in exploring in this book, through a close attention to historical documents such as rare dance films, photographs, print materials, memoirs, and a host of other historical artifacts, was how this dance form, known today as Chinese dance, or 中国舞, was actually formulated, who the individuals were who constructed this form initially, and the discourses and practices that changed over time as this dance form emerged in the socialist period in China. And one of the most interesting discoveries I made while writing the book was that the founding figures of what we today call Chinese dance all drew upon exceedingly transnational experiences in their contributions to the making of this national dance form. Thus, border-crossing connectivity and connections were at the heart of this practice, which, in its emphasis on place-based and culturally specific ethnic identities, seemed to embody the very notion of a bounded national identity. So specifically, I focus on 4 individuals as especially significant in the early decades of the founding of this dance form. And I'll be talking about each of them in detail. The first one is Dai Ailian, the second one is Kanbar Han, the third one is Che Seng-hee, and the fourth one is Liang Luan. Examining each of their lives helps us to elucidate inter-Asian dance connectivities and circulations of different kinds that were operating between the 1930s and the 1950s. So if we start with Dai Ailian's story, she was born as the 3rd or 4th generation Chinese Trinidadian. She was born and raised in Trinidad, where she began studying dance, actually with ballet, in a dance school in which she was the only dancer of Asian ethnicity, surrounded by the rest of the students who were all white. At the age of 15, she and her mother and her sister moved to England. And it was in England that she spent 10 years developing her dance career, continuing to study ballet, but also being exposed to German modern dance through teachers who were teaching in London. And she ultimately studied at Dartington Hall, which actually had a connection to the Indian school that Ming was just talking about. And while she was there, the Ballet Jos, which was a very influential modern ballet company originally from Germany, who moved to England because of the war. She actually studied with Kurt Jooss and several other very influential modernist dancers. But it was also during this period that she started to be involved with the Chinese overseas political activities, and specifically raising money to support China once the war broke out with Japan. And so in 1940, she ends up sailing to Hong Kong, spending a year there. And then she actually marries Ye Qianyu, who the art historians will, of course, recognize. He's a famous Chinese artist. And then she moves inland from Hong Kong into Chongqing, which at the time was the wartime capital. And while she's there, she establishes herself as the most influential figure in the emerging national dance scene in China. She actually tours abroad to the United States briefly, and then returns to China in 1947 and settles in Beijing, where she spends the remainder of her life. Interestingly, and this is a point I'll come back to, the type of dance that actually launched her fame while she was working in Chongqing was an intensely intercultural project in which she went to study with what at the time were known as borderland communities, such as ethnic Tibetans, ethnic Yao, and other non-Han ethnic groups in southwest China, and adapted dance styles that she learned from them into stage productions. Kanbar Han had a similarly transnational life, although moving in very different parts of the world. So she was a Uyghur dancer born in Kashgar, who with her parents emigrated to Central Asia as a child. She ended up being enrolled in a very famous dance school in Tashkent, which was led by, at the time, the most influential practitioner of Central Asian Soviet national ethnic dance, Tamara Khanum. Who actually was the subject of several essays by Langston Hughes that people may be familiar with when he traveled there in the 1930s. She ended up being recruited from Tashkent to Moscow. And then in the early 1940s, actually around the same time that Dai Ailian moved to China, she actually moved back to Xinjiang and became based in Urumqi, where she began to tour across China and promote a new style of dance that she developed that included material inspired by her own ethnic tradition of Uyghur dance, but also Kazakh dance, Uzbek dance, and other dance styles from Central Asia and Northwest China. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, she traveled regularly throughout China, and even in 1948 traveled to Taipei in Taiwan, seeding what would become the now very widespread dance style known as ethnic minority dance in China. Chesing-He is a figure that many people may be familiar with because she crossed not only the boundaries of dance, but also became a popular culture icon in colonial Korea, who appeared in films, in fashion magazines, and a number of other popular culture publications. Chesing-He grew up during the Japanese colonial period in Korea. She went to Tokyo, like many dancers of the period. In 1926, she moved there and began studying with a very influential modernist dancer in Japan known as Ishibaku. Initially, her dance styles were inspired by Western dance forms. But in the mid-1930s, in 1934, she became actually the most famous for launching a new style of dance known as Shinmuyong, or New Dance, New Korean dance, which was inspired by a range of different local cultural practices ranging from shamanism to historical dances to Buddhist monks. Chesing-He's fame actually spread beyond Asia, and she did a world tour in 1938 to 1940. The first very famous East Asian dancer actually to tour widely internationally, visiting North America, Europe, and also many countries in Central and South America. And then she returned actually at the height of Pan-Asianism in the Japanese Empire, and she continued to tour through Japanese-occupied territories in China. She expanded her repertoire, reflecting the Pan-Asianist ideology of the time to include dances inspired by Chinese opera characters, as well as additional dance styles based on Korean and Japanese material. She befriended Mei Lanfang, the most famous opera performer of the time, who was actually protesting the Japanese occupation by refusing to perform. And she claimed to have been inspired actually by his attitude. She resided temporarily in Beijing, began studying Chinese opera, and began creating dances and teaching students based on Chinese opera movement. And the last person that I mentioned earlier is Leeuwen. He was a native of Guangzhou, actually the only of the four people that I've mentioned who was born and raised in China. And during the war, he was forced to flee the coastal areas like many others across China at the time. He moved inland to Kunming. And similar to Dai Ailian, he became inspired by the ethnic minority dance forms that were being practiced by communities in China's western regions. But at the same time, he was also inspired by German and other European modernist dance forms that were being imported into China during the same period. And he created strikingly different choreographies actually at the same time in 1940s Kunming. And what's interesting for us is that when the Civil War broke out in China, Leeuwen and his company actually left the mainland, moved to Hong Kong, and became the first company to promote leftist new dance from China in the Sinophone world in Southeast Asia. They spent 2 years touring Thailand, Malaya, and Singapore before Leeuwen eventually moved back to China and became a major figure in the Chinese dance scene. And while he was touring in Southeast Asia, he not only performed Chinese dance and the new modernist works that he had created, but also studied local dance forms and created choreographies inspired by Burmese, Indonesian, and other Southeast Asian dance styles. So the revolutionary Chinese socialist dance that we see emerge in the 1950s and 60s in the PRC, and which then in the later 1950s and early 1960s was also circulated around the world, especially in socialist and post-colonial contexts as symbols of socialist China, were in fact products of these dancers' earlier border crossing activities that I've just summarized, all of which occurred prior to the founding of the PRC, but nevertheless laid the aesthetic and ideological and personal foundations for these new dance practices. These inter-Asian connections were thus underlying the new leftist dance aesthetics and representations of China as a multi-ethnic nation state with its own distinct folk and classical culture. So now I want to transition from looking at how transnational movements inspired the construction of a national dance form and actually think about what these different networks of transnational connectivity were during this period and how we can think about them as ways to construct these floating constellations of connectivity that are overlapping, that are intersecting, and yet are also distinct in terms of their aesthetic practices, their geographic networks, and also the way that they actually conceptualized Asia during this period. And this is the topic of this new book project that I'm working on now. So the first of these networks that I want to explore further is a network that is shaped around the very politicized notion of the overseas Chinese, which has been critiqued by scholars such as Shufen, who Ming actually talked about a few minutes ago, as well as others. And so there's a movement now within Chinese studies to conceptualize this overseas Chinese community as Sinophone communities that actually have very local cultural practices that need to be acknowledged and not necessarily in relationship to China specifically. And if we look at how the Sinophone world actually constituted a floating constellation or a transnational network for dance during this period, the two figures that I've already mentioned, Leeuwen and Leeuwen, both show us two different aspects of this transnational network. Leeuwen's helping us to think more about the transnational Chinese diasporic communities in North and South America and how they connected to those communities in Asia. And then, of course, with Leeuwen helping us to think about these communities in Southeast Asia, which continued to be very active sources of cultural experimentation and transnational communication throughout the Cold War. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But apart from them, there are some other actually also very fascinating figures in dance history who can help us to further fill out this concept of a Sinophone transnational dance network during this period. So the first one is Sylvia, it's actually Silan, but in English she used the name Silan Chen, who was also born in Trinidad. She was a second cousin of Leeuwen. And she was a mixed race. Her father was Eugene Chen, a very famous Chinese diplomat, and her mother was a French Creole woman, actually descended from a former slave. Sylvia actually became a professional dancer at a young age, and interestingly was one of the only modernist dancers in the 1930s and 40s to pursue a career both in Moscow and in New York. It was very unusual at the time. And her life became especially complicated because after she moved to the United States, she of course became the subject of intense FBI investigations because of her association with the leftist movement, and she actually created many dances with very politicized themes in addition to creating dances specifically on themes of Chinese identity. Eventually, she made her way to China in the late 1950s and early 60s, but she also didn't really fit in there because she was a modernist. And at that time, modernism was considered to be part of the capitalist bourgeois aesthetic that was not welcome in Maoist China. And so she struggled to be accepted. She couldn't speak Chinese, and there's a whole host of issues around her identity also as a mixed race person that come to light in that context. And eventually, she actually worked in Hollywood in the United States and shows us another sort of aspect of this inter-Asian connectivity because she was, of course, cast to portray many roles in Hollywood cinema, such as a Thai dancer in Anna and the King, an Arabian dancer in Slave Girl. And so she came to embody Orientalist notions of inter-Asian identity within the US context, in part because her movement was limited due to her political surveillance. On the opposite side of this expanded notion of Sinophone transnationalism is Li Shufen, who many people know as the founder of Chinese dance in Singapore. She was actually born and raised in Taiwan, studied dance in Tokyo during the Japanese colonial period, and actually was touring throughout the US allied Asian world during the late 1950s and early 1960s, in some ways presenting a type of Chinese dance that could compete with the dance forms that were being circulated among leftist communities on the part of the PRC. And then in the early 1960s, she actually emigrates to Singapore and begins to train the first generation of what are now the founding figures of Chinese dance in Singapore. And so she represents the flip side of the leftist dance network in the Chinese-speaking world, and reminds us that actually oftentimes these Taiwan-centered and PRC-centered communities of Chinese dance intersected and overlapped and competed directly with each other throughout Sinophone Southeast Asia, as well as Sinophone communities in other parts of the world. The next transnational network that I want to think about is that centered around Soviet Central Asia. And the two figures I already discussed are Kemba Han and her teacher, Tamara Khanum, who's actually Armenian by ethnicity, but became the symbolic founding figure of Uzbek national dance. And interestingly, the dance styles that they projected were associated with specifically the unveiling of Muslim women in Central Asia. And this was actually quite significant for how the dance performances were understood internationally. It made the presentation of what would look to us as a quote-unquote traditional ethnic dance form actually take on meaning as a representation of socialist feminism and the concept of liberating women in Central Asia from the strictures of Islam, which was, of course, part of the ideology of the Soviet Union at the time. And so many other dancers that I've just mentioned, Sylvia Chen, Leeuwen, and Dai Ailian also created choreographies in which they embodied these Central Asian female identities and circulated them throughout the leftist dance network as a symbol of a type of progressive femininity. In terms of the Japanese Imperial Inter-Asian Network, Ishibaku, who was Chesenghi's teacher and who's known as the founder of Japanese modern dance, actually had a whole host of disciples across the Japanese colonial sphere who ended up becoming leaders in their own homes across Asia. So apart from Chesenghi, who became a founding figure of New Korean dance, both in South Korea and North Korea, he also taught figures such as Cai Yue, who was an influential figure in Taiwanese dance, especially in the post-war period, Jia Zuoguang, who was an ethnically Manchu dancer but became the founding figure of Mongolian dance in China. And then Wu Xiaobang was not directly Ishibaku's student, but studied with one of Ishibaku's contemporaries, who had actually also studied abroad in Europe and the United States and promoted a Western style of modern dance in Japan. And Wu Xiaobang went back to China and was sort of competing with Dai Ailian in the effort to design the new image of PRC dance. And whereas Dai Ailian promoted what became known as Chinese dance, Wu Xiaobang attempted to actually continue to promote the modernist dance styles that he had studied in Germany, although he was not very successful because, as I mentioned earlier, such styles were not welcome in China in the 1950s. But he nevertheless went on to play an extremely central role in the institutional development of dance in China, in part because, unlike many of the other figures I mentioned, who, because of their transnational and diasporic lives, were not able to read and write Chinese, Wu Xiaobang was born and raised in China and actually came from a very well-educated background, and so he was able to actually do the administrative and the theoretical work that many of these other dancers, especially women dancers who came from outside China, were not able to actually take part in. So there was also a gendered power dynamic at play among these figures in China. But if we think about the Japanese Empire as an important transnational network within Asia, in the development of modern Asian dance forms in the 20th century, one of the things we can see is that the Cold War actually shaped these trajectories in very clear ways. And so in Chesenghi's case, as I mentioned, she actually toured China during the early 1940s, touring in Japanese-occupied areas. And in 1945, when the Japanese surrendered, she at first stayed in China, actually, and then she returned to Seoul, her birthplace. However, because of her participation in the Japanese colonial performance sphere, and also in part because her husband, An Mak, was closely associated with the proletarian leftist writers movement, Che Sing-hee was heavily criticized in the public sphere for being a collaborator with the Japanese, and then also for being potentially someone who used her art to just serve whichever person was in power at the time. And she decided to actually emigrate to North Korea in 1946. She remained there. She became a leading architect of the North Korean dance movement. And one of the interesting things I think that this shows is the flexibility of the Pan-Asianism that was developed during the Japanese colonial period, because Che Sing-hee was able to adapt that actually to suit the new ideologies of socialist nation building, of socialist internationalism centered around concepts of the East in Asia. And her dance styles actually were able to persist actually throughout her period in North Korea. And as a contrast, you have someone like Cai Ruiyue, this Taiwanese dancer who also studied with Ishibaku in Tokyo a couple years after Che Sing-hee in the 1930s. And when she returned to Taiwan, she was also associated with the leftist movement, and she was actually imprisoned because her husband was a public supporter of leftism in Taiwan. And so her movement was actually heavily restricted because the KMT government took away her abilities to tour and put her on constant surveillance in a way that was similar to what Sylvia Chun was experiencing in the United States. And so through these parallel journeys of these transnational figures, we can see how, on the one hand, their movements in some ways challenge what we think of traditionally as the Cold War circuits in terms of where people with certain genealogies or artistic styles were able to travel. And oftentimes they traveled across those lines in unexpected ways. But at the same time, the politics of the Cold War still did have a very significant impact on their lives, and in some ways either facilitated or restricted their abilities to move. So in the case of Li Shufen, the founder of Chinese dance in Singapore that I mentioned earlier, the Cold War politics really facilitated her movement from Taiwan to places like Bangkok, and then later to Malaysia and Singapore, because she became a spokesperson for the quote-unquote free world in Asia. And then you had people like Che Sing-hee who were also movement facilitated by their political alliances, in the sense that she continued to travel to the PRC. She toured in Eastern Europe, Moscow, and other parts of the socialist world after she moved to North Korea as well. And then lastly, I want to look at the Bandung moment in the 1950s as another network of inter-Asian connectivity that actually led to a lot of very interesting cross-ethnic exchanges, artistic collaborations that crossed what we would normally think of as Cold War divisions within Asia. So if we look at one specific figure who embodied many of these ideas in the Chinese context, that would be Zhang Jun, who's pictured here on the left performing an Indian dance that she learned from Uday Shankar, a very influential figure in Indian modern dance history. And then in the center, she's performing a Burmese dance that she learned from Burmese artists who were touring China, and then later performed at the palace in Burma for President UNU as part of a diplomatic exchange. And then here, she's performing a Balinese dance that she learned from Balinese artists who were actually stationed at the Beijing Dance Academy, the National Dance Conservatory in China in the late 1950s, alongside Soviet ballet dancers, teaching Balinese dance as part of this explicit effort to use dance as a medium of diplomatic exchange and solidarity building during the Bandung era. So Zhang Jun was actually the leading dancer of this interesting dance company that was established in China in 1962, known as the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble. And this ensemble very explicitly embodied the Bandung ideals in the sense that it was an ensemble dedicated specifically to the performance of Asian, African, and Latin American dance styles. But if we look closely at the images, you'll see here that there's an enormous amount of ethnic impersonation that's involved in the performances. It's especially striking, although there aren't any photographs here, but when the Chinese dancers are portraying African people in the dance forms. They do actually wear the darkened skin makeup that we would normally associate with blackface in the American context. And yet they're doing it as a way to express anti-colonial, inter-Asian, Asian-African solidarity. So it really forces us, I think, to think in really complicated ways about the meaning of this kind of cross-ethnic performance in different historical contexts. And here, of course, you can also see them performing Mexican dances, dances from other parts of Asia, a dance from Cambodia, for example, but these are all performed by Chinese dancers and musicians. And then lastly, there's some other interesting examples from the Bandung period that don't necessarily fit with the aesthetics or the geopolitics that we normally associate with Bandung. So it makes sense to think about India, Indonesia, Burma, and China as part of this assemblage. We wouldn't normally include Japan necessarily when thinking about this moment. And yet there were parallel constellations sort of occurring, specifically around this dancer, Michiko Matsuyama, who was a leftist ballerina who founded her own dance company in Tokyo and actually was the first dancer to stage the very famous revolutionary Chinese opera, White-Haired Girl by Mao Nu, as a ballet performance. And she actually performed it in China in 1958. And inspired the creation of the very famous revolutionary ballet on the same theme. And she was very proactively and self-consciously fostering Sino-Japanese alliances. Of course, at the moment that we know, in the Cold War, China and Japan would not have been political allies. And what's further interesting in this case is that she's not performing the national or ethnic dance styles that were often considered to be the embodiments of anti-colonial aesthetics in this period. So for example, in China at this time, ballet was actually considered, even though it was a Soviet import, it was considered to represent a European embodied aesthetic, and in that sense was considered to be not appropriate for the expression of China's revolutionary dance culture. But that actually changed with the introduction of Matsuyama's company performing these ballet performances from the perspective of an Asian dancer embodying a revolutionary character. And of course here she's embodying a Chinese peasant. So there's an element of class impersonation as well as ethnic impersonation. But here she's doing it through the ballet aesthetic that prior to this had been associated with Western bourgeois aesthetics. And so she was really challenging what types of dance aesthetics could be considered to be expressions of inter-Asian solidarity. So I just want to close by saying that in addition to breaking down East-West and Cold War binaries, I think it's also exciting and important for us to recognize the multiple Asias that exist within Asia. And I hope that by theorizing and historicizing these different inter-Asian networks in relation to one another, we can also begin to trace the intersections and resonances between the inter-Asian networks themselves. So thank you.